also working in conjunction with Jean House of Soul Communication in this webinar series, serving as the host, as well as providing a number of interactive presentations. So thank you for being here once again. We so appreciate and are blessed with you being in the audience, so thank you so much. Tonight, I welcome you to the 7th in what has become a 10-part webinar series sponsored by Jean House of Soul Communication and in association with the Institute of Noetic Sciences. We are adding an encore presentation of Shape Your Mindset that will be presented on Thursday, September 20th, at same time, same channel, but it's on a Thursday evening. I will be presenting on September 19th and then again on September 20th. Soul Communication, as you know, is a company dedicated to growing new insights for conscious lifestyles. And Jean will be sending emails updating you on all the upcoming events on the schedule. So thank you so much, Jean. I've had the honor to introduce Dr. Sharon Joy Ng several times before, and I gladly do so again this evening as she engages you in tonight's presentation of Feeling Your Boundaries. Sharon presented her first in a series of 3 webinars on August 1st entitled Awakening to Your Soul Story, and she followed up with her second webinar on August 22nd with Finding Spaces for the Soul. Before we begin, I'd like to once again highlight for you Sharon's academic and professional background because it's amazing. Sharon earned her BA and MA in psychology and her PhD in clinical psychology. As a tenured professor of psychology for over 22 years in the Yuba Community College District, she has taught at a number of institutions of higher learning, including Yuba College, Woodland Community College, California State University in Sacramento, American River College, Sacramento City College, Sierra College, and California State University in Fresno. The courses she taught included general psychology, gender, consciousness studies, codependence, human sexuality, abnormal psychology, personal and social adjustment, and personality theories. Sharon has also authored 3 books. They are Metaphors of the Feminine and Masculine, Creating a Personal Mythology, and another book, Breaking the Code of Codependence, Becoming Conscious Through the Transpersonal. Her most recent publication is a topical reader through the National Social Science Press entitled Body, Mind, and Psyche. Sharon has studied with David Feinstein, Stanley Krippner, Bruce Lipton, Stanislav Grof, Charles Tart, Anna Wise, and Grandmaster Montauk Chia. And Sharon, I hope I've pronounced their names correctly. You'll correct me if I do not. With a first-degree black belt in Taekwondo, I would say the bottom line is this: don't mess with Sharon. At the end of Sharon's presentation this evening, we will open the chat room for a question and answer period, and you'll find that in the left-hand corner, as you always do. Please don't be shy, and I know you aren't. You'll find the chat box located where I indicated, and below that is where you can type in your questions, your thoughts, your ideas, your suggestions, anything you wish. Sharon will address all of these for you at the end of her presentation. So, without further ado, let me give a warm welcome to Sharon. Sharon, take it away.
Thanks, Kathy. You did really well. You pronounced all those names just like they are supposed to be pronounced. So I want to welcome everybody to this, actually it's my last webinar in this series, Feeling Our Boundaries Inside and Out. And I'm really excited to talk about this because this is really my forte. When we looked at the title, how we were going to name this particular event for what I'm talking about today, Feeling Our Boundaries Inside and Out, I thought it was just perfect because it really outlines what we're going to be talking about as far as relationships and especially codependence. So I know codependence is sort of a hot topic, probably always has been, because most of us have problems with relationships probably because of the boundaries that we either do have or that we have not identified yet. So I just wanted to start out with this particular slide with the water lily again, and to remind you that this water lily represents our spiritual evolvement. It represents us, and like each of the petals that are in the water lily, that there are so many facets to who we are as an individual, and that we're so complex, and to understand everything that goes into making up who we become is really worth investigating. But before I start, I wanted to express my gratitude to the Institute of Noetic Sciences, IONS, who is sponsoring this particular webinar in conjunction with Dr. Stanley Krippner's live event, which will be occurring at the end of this month, and I'll talk about that at the end of my presentation. But I especially wanted to thank Jean House, who's just been a wonderful guide and a wonderful mentor in many, many ways. She's the host of this webinar series, and she is the director and owner of Soul Communications. So thank you so much, Jean. This has just been a great opportunity, and I'm really looking forward to being with you again and Dr. Stanley Krippner and Kathy at the end of the month at IONS. And I hope that those of you listening are going to be joining us there. This particular slide here was sort of my review of where we have been on our journey, but Kathy did such a wonderful job describing the three webinars that I have addressed, but they all fit into this container of reshaping our lives. And so I wanted to remind you that, the first awakening to our soul story, that was really about reshaping our attitude. And we talked about the Myers-Briggs and learning about our particular preferences for knowing the world, and whether you're an introvert or an extrovert, how that really translates into the way you in a sense, use your energy. And then when we look at the functions of how a person prefers to know the world, they're either a thinker or a feeler, or they use their bodies and their five senses, or their intuition. So I hope that those of you who were able to listen to the replays were able to download that document that I gave you about understanding your own typology. And then finding spaces for our soul to be present was our last one, where we're really reshaping our mind. And in reshaping our mind, I also introduced everyone to some Qigong practices, and I'll be doing the same at the live event. So we'll be expanding our knowledge about how to make room and make spaces for our soul to emerge. And today I'm going to be discussing feeling our boundaries inside and out. So reshaping our vitality, that's the theme of this particular series, these last three webinars that we're doing. And I wanted to talk about the whole idea that, boundaries, we need to identify our boundaries before we can either expand or let them go. And what I wanted us to do today is to explore the idea that where do our boundaries come from? How did they form? What do they consist of? And if we were to understand what those boundaries are and how they were developed, is there a way for us to begin to, make room in our psyche for the true self to emerge? Because much of what is in our psyche already is bounded by notions and ideas of how we have come to know the world. So I believe that when we understand how these boundaries were formed, we will be infused with our essential vitality, because we will be living our own truths instead of the truths that we came to believe were the truths we were supposed to believe. I hope that makes sense. As I think about boundaries, I think of them in two different ways. Primarily, I think of boundaries as something that can encompass things, something that can, in a sense, in our minds and also in our lives, our boundaries can confine us. And that's not necessarily bad, because when we have boundaries that we set in place in our lives, it gives us a sense of safety. It gives us a sense of the known. And one of the things that humans don't deal very well with is chaos. And so one of the things that we always are looking for is this idea of, where are my boundaries? What can I count on? So one way we can look at boundaries is that they confine us, is they sort of corral us and they allow us to be able to, like I said, feel safe. But at the same time, remember when there's a boundary around us, then we've already created what we call outside the boundary. Okay, so again, when we're talking about boundaries, we're also going to be talking about the notion of our definitions of a lot of words that we use and how the way that we have defined the words that we use and the concepts that we have defined, that those in themselves can create a boundary for us that does not necessarily allow our soul to emerge. The opposite, or maybe it's not the opposite, maybe it's that first we have to identify the internal boundaries that are in place before we can begin to use that boundary as a growing edge. So I saw boundaries in two ways. I saw them, number one, like confining us, but also on the other hand, they represent to me my growing edge, because now that I am more sure of what my boundaries, my internal boundaries are and how they formed, and I understand what those are, it doesn't mean that those notions necessarily go away, but at least I understand so that I can begin to use consciousness to begin to live a more conscious life and to make more conscious decisions. So we're going to be exploring how our boundaries serve us once we've identified where these boundaries come from. So the boundaries that I think about in regards to relationships, because this seminar, this particular webinar, is actually going to be about codependence. And I teach a course in codependence, and I wrote a book called Breaking the Code of Codependence, which I'll show you at the end of this webinar also. But I wrote that book as a result of my dissertation work, and so it was really important to me to be able to make my dissertation friendly. So I wrote the books so that I could use it in the classroom and so that other people could begin to examine codependence in a way that is different from the way it has been presented in the popular press. So we're going to be probably bashing some notions about what codependence is, and maybe not even bashing it, but at least clarifying what codependence truly is. So when we talk about codependence, we're always talking about this idea that it's a relationship problem, that it is an interrelationship problem, because when we think about this idea that we are codependent, it usually is a relationship to someone else. So when I think of boundaries, I have my boundaries that are in relationship to other people, but at the same time, I have to look at the more important boundary of my interrelationship with myself. In other words, do I have any boundaries, and can I identify what those boundaries are so that I know what is truly coming from within me versus basically just what I've learned. So we're going to be exploring these two concepts, but it's my idea that the place that we have to begin is we have to begin on the inside. If we don't explore our interrelationship before we start looking at interrelationships, I think we're going into the process without enough tools. And in order to understand the nature of our interrelationships, we have to understand what our nature of our own relationship to ourself is. So some of the questions that we're going to be asking ourselves as we start to explore this idea is, what is it that I need? Do you know what you need? You know, a lot of people don't know what they need. What do I want? A lot of people don't know what they want. A lot of people, especially in codependence, they'll say, I need you to stop doing what you're doing, or I want you to do what I want you to do so that it makes me feel better, you know. So we're going to explore those ideas and where that concept comes from, and how really it's just an intra-relationship problem that creates this external kind of interrelationship problem that we have with other people, because we, in a sense, have blurred. I mean, there's been a step in the process of our development where we either never formed boundaries, or what boundaries we did have were very blurry. And so we don't know really, in a sense, where we begin and where the other person begins. And so that, in a sense, can be a problematic relationship boundary. And so I'm going to ask, in a sense, those boundaries, the things that we ask ourselves, what do I need? What do I want? Do they serve my soul? Do they serve my soul needs? And again, how healthy are my boundaries? I love this list here. I mean, if you look at codependence, codependence. Let me just sort of like talk a little bit about the way that it had been. It's commonly understood. Most of my students, right away I'll ask them, what is your definition before you even read a page of this book? What is your definition of codependence? And most people will say, well, it means that I need somebody. I am dependent upon having another person in my life, so I can't be without a relationship. Okay, so that's sort of the popular definition, and as we go through this, and when you look at this list, you'll see that there have been so many areas that have been identified in the literature about where the problems exist in a person's life when they are, and I hate to say diagnosed with codependence, because then it sounds like it's a disease, and there is a disease concept of codependence, but I don't think it's very viable, because if we really look at the underlying reasons for why people behave in codependent ways, then it makes more sense. So I will try to refrain from labeling people as being codependent, but that they actually behave in codependent ways. And if you learn those behaviors, the good thing is you can unlearn them. So I'm not going to talk about everything on this list, but I just wanted you to know that in the literature review that I had done for my dissertation, these were the problems that emerged for people who were diagnosed with codependence. So problems interrelating with other people, problems with their own relationship to themselves, their interrelationship. They were labeled as being enabling other people in their addictions. They were labeled as being over nurturing and over caretaking, but one of the things that we could also describe is that it translates almost into a need for control. In other words, it appears as if the person is trying to control another person. Okay, but I'll talk about where that really comes from, and I don't think it's really a need for controlling the other person. It's more of a need to avoid chaos. So boundaries are unclear, person's insecure, there's an element of learned helplessness in there. In other words, when we have learned helplessness, what that means is that in our efforts to make things different when we were younger, we found that we couldn't change things. So basically, we just gave up. So that's what learned helplessness is. So growing up with oppressive rules, there's triangulation, parentification. We'll talk about that. A willingness to suffer, that's what it appears to be. But again, we're going to be looking at many of these features as we move along in this webinar. Okay, so symptoms of codependence. These are basically those characteristics that when people come into the setting of a therapist setting and they describe their relationships as being problematic, these are some of the other prominent features of the way that they would describe themselves, that they have a hard time identifying and expressing their feelings. And I would say that probably the reason why they have difficulty identifying and expressing their feelings is because they don't know their feelings. Okay, and that in a sense really comes from the way in which a person was reared, and I'll talk about that more. There's a need for perfectionism. There seems to be difficulty forming, maintaining close relationships, a rigidity in attitudes and behaviors. You've probably heard all this before. That over responsibility. A person who has symptoms of codependence will often feel that they are responsible for everybody else's feelings and that they're responsible for everybody else's reactions or responses. And that is probably one of the biggest problems that emerges, and therefore translates into this idea that it seems as if that person is trying to control the other person because they're feeling a sense of over responsibility. Okay, but just hold on to that idea there, because I'm going to be talking more deeply about where that sense of over responsibility comes from. So there seems to be a need for approval. You'll notice I didn't put a need for love. Really underlying all of this is the need for love. But when we talk about somebody who is suffering from the symptoms of codependence, It really translates into behaviors that bring on acceptance, behaviors that bring on approval, because um, I think the person's definition of love has been skewed. If a person truly knew what they needed and wanted, then they would be able to say, well, I need love. That's what I want, and that's what I need. But because maybe love was not forthcoming in the family environment, they settled for approval. So if I can't be loved, being approved of or being accepted is, the next best thing. Okay, so I'm going to move to the next slide where we're going to learn a little bit more about this whole idea about interrelationship boundaries or lack thereof, and how it translates into behaviors that make a person seem as if they believe that they are an expert on what is good for other people. And so you'll hear this a lot from people who are sort of trapped in this sort of cycle, that what would make them happy is if other people would only behave in the ways that they felt that would, you know, uh, be more conducive to a calmer environment. Okay, and that's just a personal opinion, really. When people are doing that, it's the way that the person has learned to avoid chaos in their environment. So they became basically hyper vigilant to everything that was going on around them when they were growing up so that they could avoid the chaos. Okay, so again, like I said, self-worth is based on the idea that I'm needed. So when I can get somebody to stop doing what I don't want them to do, and they stop doing it for a day or two, then I feel like I'm needed, and I feel like I'm worthwhile, and I'm valuable, which is, I mean, that's good, I guess, but I think it's very sad if what I'm really looking for is love. So I want to go into, really, we're going to cover three major areas that contribute to the development of codependent behaviors. And I think that we have to really look at the complexity of all the factors that go into a person believing the way that they do believe, that translates into what we call these codependent behaviors. So we're going to be looking at, well, what are the societal contributions that exacerbate the development of codependent behaviors, whether you're male or female. And then we're going to be looking at the different cultures, the whole idea that different cultures stress different behaviors as being expected and acceptable. And so when we look at ethnicity, and when we look at religion, when we look at, even, gender roles, when we look at those kinds of factors, we'll see that males and females have been prescribed, in a sense, to behave in particular ways that represent their particular gender. And so you've got this whole idea of masculinity and femininity, and never shall the two meet, that in fact, I think that's been very harmful to the individual and to people in their relationships when we ascribe that certain behaviors only belong to one gender or the other. So again, the geographical area that when a person grows up in, that could be considered a culture, because the cultures of whether you're living in the city or whether you're living in a rural area are going to be different, and therefore you're going to have different behaviors modeled to you. You're going to have different mindsets that actually emerge from not only the geographical location that you live in, but also the educational level of not only your parents, but the people that are in the particular area in which you live too. Economic status has another big part in influencing why some people end up, behaving in ways that seem to reflect that they're, relying on other people to make them happy, in a sense. Okay. But I think probably, then we're going to filter down to the most minute level, and that would be the family. So I sort of see this as an inverted pyramid, where we're going to look at society, where society are the larger factors that contribute to the development of codependence. And then we'll go on down to the cultures, and then we'll get down to the family and the particular things that can go on in a family that create the development of these kinds of behaviors that we call codependence. So how does patriarchy influence a person growing up? You know, think about this. When we're growing up and we grow up in a society that is a patriarchal society, the first thing we have to ask ourselves, well, what does patriarchy mean? What would it mean to live in a patriarchal society? If you look down at this particular circle here where it says maleness establishes the ideals, what that means is that patriarchy really is male-dominated society where the laws and the rules and most of the power goes to the male gender. You can see that very well in our own society, and I think that in order to really understand where our society has emerged from is that we have to go back in time historically to see that most societies have been patriarchal and that there has been this establishment of maleness as being more ideal than femaleness. In fact, when you look at if we were to make two lists where we're looking at what are the descriptors that we would use to describe males, what are the descriptors we would use to describe females, we're actually looking at one that is better than the other. Because most of us would agree, if I build a list and I say strong, independent, powerful, autonomous, non-emotional, you probably put that on the male side, right? But then when I look on the female side and then I start to use words like interdependence, connection, intimacy, emotional, dependent, submissive, we start to go, I don't want to be those things, you know. I mean, I'd rather be on the male side. So this has created a false dichotomy where we begin to believe that to be more male-like will lead to greater mental health, and that's been kind of erroneous for a lot of females who are the predominant gender who suffer from codependent behaviors. Although, you know, there are many males who also say, you know, I'm reading your book and I'm like, gosh, I have these kinds of behaviors too, so I guess I'm not immune. So, but I want you to think about how patriarchy has established maleness as an ideal, and so therefore, when we start looking at, well, how can I get better? If you look at the recovery movement, for example, it's a movement where you are to separate yourself, you are to become more independent and more, what we'll say, self-sufficient. And if you'll notice, those are all masculine kinds of words, but not necessarily the words that reflect the female experience when she's growing up, because a female grows up learning interdependence. She learns about nurturing. She learns about caretaking. And those are all supposed to be ideals for the female. And yet, in codependence, what we're saying is that, well, you're doing it too much. You're caring about me too much. You're nurturing me too much. You know, back off. So, you know, we need to look at that particular dichotomy and see how that has created this sort of like perception that those kinds of behaviors that we label as being codependent are not ideal, and that you are, in a sense, mentally ill. Okay, I hate using that because I think it's more of a learned behavior than anything else, and that, you know, we do have a chance to unlearn it. The other thing that society creates, and down here in this yellow circle that you see, or, you know, egg-shaped circle, is that I talk about layering, and what I meant by layering is that the layering in society creates power inequities. And when we have power inequities, in other words, we have experts, and then we have para-experts, and then we have people that aren't experts, and then we, you know, so we have this whole layering in society where there are people that we believe know more than we do about ourselves. So in a sense, we have handed over our own power and our own seniority to what is good and what is what we need and what is right for us, what is true for us. We've handed that over to other people, and that creates, in a sense, this whole idea that you know, that I need other people to tell me what is good for me. You know, it's sort of the codependence, and it has been described as being the behaviors of the subservient. So when you look at society and you look at who are the classes of people that we consider to be more subservient classes, we start to see that we're looking at this layering, and we're also looking at this dominance, this dominance and ranking, where we have certain ethnic groups that we would see as being in more power than other ethnic groups. And so when if you, for example, a lot of times if we start talking about maleness is predominant over femaleness, you also have to consider, well, are we talking about a male who is Caucasian, or are we talking about a male who is Asian or Hispanic or African American? Because it's going to make a big difference, because the ethnic classes will not enjoy the same privileges as those males who are from the predominant class. So again, patriarchy has created all this layering that in fact almost creates this kind of behavior where the people from the subservient, I'll call it the subservient class, although they're not, but where they are vigilant and they are looking out to see what does the person who is in higher rank, what does that person need, and what can I do to make things better for that person, or what can I get other people to do or to not do that will make that other person happy. So that's codependence right there, when we're doing chaos control, where we're trying to get people and ourselves to monitor our behaviors so that we don't set off any kind of chaos. Okay. Moving into the cultural factors, again, I think that this is tied in directly to this idea of patriarchy and how society has, created an environment where there is all this layering. And also, the one other thing I want to say about society is that when I think of society, I think of the mass media, and I think that the mass media perpetuates a lot of these notions, and it also presents us with these images of what it means to be, better, to be happier, to be successful. And a lot of us can't reach those kinds of lofty goals that are set for us. And so we start to feel like we don't measure up. So what happens there? Then we begin to, get involved in addictive behaviors, and there's a lot of things that can happen with that. That goes beyond drug use. Okay, so let me talk about the cultural influences now, because again, I think this is very similar in the sense that religions are probably more traditional in the ways that they see how males and females, and I'm going to use this word purposefully, should behave. That they should behave like a female or should behave like a male, and that those roles are much more confined, and they're much more stereotypical. And so that creates, again, a tendency towards developing codependent behaviors, because, again, we're looking at females who are reared to be the caretakers and the homemakers and the emotional barometers in families. In fact, we have different cultures that are very patriarchal and will definitely frown upon and maybe not even allow one class or one group, one gender, probably the female gender, to not participate in certain things because it's only for males. Our society, again, we look at the political environment, we look at the geographical area and in the economic conditions in which we grew up in, and those things can create this feeling of, I think of being less worthy than you really are, because we're all valuable. And so a lot of this interpretation of ourselves has come through the filters of society and culture. And so we have to consider, well, what were the cultures that were in my life that really helped me, or maybe not helped me, but in a sense created these beliefs that I have about what is appropriate and right for me to do as a man or a woman. So gender roles, again, I just wanted to express this. This picture represents to me that when we are too rigid in the way that we allow ourselves to express who we are, that we are filling up the space in our soul with things that aren't necessarily serving us. And that the more rigid we are, the less able we are to be able to explore and to be able to expand our boundaries and to fill our lives with vitality, the essential vitality that comes from living from within our soul. And so these stereotypes that are perpetuated in the mass media through the internet, through TV, through billboards. Billboards are famous for doing that too. Um, and these ideas of that, that like I have a car there because to me the car represents materialism. And so when we think that we need this and we need that and I don't have this, so as soon as I have that I will be on the road to success, that basically creates feelings of powerlessness, and that translates into basically what I would consider to be the codependent standpoint again, because we don't feel that we are empowered, and so we look outside of ourselves for answers when really the answers are all inside of us. It's just that maybe we haven't identified them yet. And this theoretical model is really coming from the psychodynamic model. And if you'll remember in the second, I think it was the second webinar that I did, I talked about the bubbles in the unconscious, and how I talked about how those bubbles in the unconscious also come from our inheritance as human beings. And Jung called this our archetypes. He said that these archetypal types of situations that we encounter throughout our lives, we already have a predisposition to respond to those situations in a predisposed way that is unconscious. And so we don't even have to think about what we're going to do when something confronts us, because in a sense it's already programmed into us. But remember, what's programmed into you is a stereotype. It's a very undeveloped form of what that particular situation might be. Okay, so I think I talked about the first kiss and how the first kiss, in your mind would be, oh, it's gonna be like fireworks. There's gonna be skyrockets going off. It's gonna be the most wonderful, luscious moment I've ever experienced. And yet, when you do encounter and you cross the threshold and you do get that first kiss, how many times have people said, oh my God, it was so awkward. We bumped teeth. It was so slobbery. I don't know if I want to do that. I'm going to have to perfect this. So, when we look at the ideas of codependence, you look at the light green arrow there, and I've got a number of descriptors in there: femininity, emotional, caretaker, nurturer, mother, wife, daughter, sister. Those are archetypal patterns of behavior that we are born into this life believing encompass particular kinds of behaviors. So, like I said, on an unconscious level, we're already programmed to believe that women, it's primarily women, should have these particular kind of characteristics within their psyche, and if they don't, then there must be something wrong with them, right? But we know that, that's not individuation. And Jung also talked about the idea that individuation was really the driving force that moves each person to examine these stereotypes, to be able to look at everything that we're looking at through this whole series, and to be able to look and see, well, does that really apply to me? Does that work for me? And if it doesn't work for me, what am I going to do instead? Can I be a little more masculine? Can I be independent? Can I be the breadwinner and still be feminine? Can I still be a woman and still have feminine characteristics and masculine characteristics? I think we call this androgyny. So let's get down to what I call the nitty-gritty of codependence. And I think the biggest factor in creating these kinds of behaviors where we begin to relate our own self to this label called codependence, that it actually starts right in the family. Okay, now this is not to say that all families are actually, creating this on purpose, okay? But I love this. Remember, as far as anyone knows, we are a nice, normal family. But let me talk about what normality means too. Of course, we know that when we look at the normal curve, normality just means this is what most people do. Okay. Well, when when you examine basically the whole concept of codependence and the idea of a functional family versus a dysfunctional family, we find that what a normal family is the dysfunctional family. Because if 97% of us come from dysfunctional families, like John Bradshaw says, he's one of the persons who says that, and there's many more who will also cite that same percentage, that if 97% of us come from dysfunctional family, then what a normal family is really the dysfunctional family. Okay, so, if you brag, I'm from a dysfunctional family, then you're really just part of the norm. But anyway, what happens in that family of origin where the internal boundaries for a person might not develop? Okay, I think this is really important because of the because those internal boundaries did not develop. Where the boundaries are for a person who relates to codependent symptoms, I would say their boundaries are way out there. They're not inside them, because if you ask a person who complains of codependent symptoms, if you ask them, well, what is it that you need? What is it that you need? Well, their answer is always in reference to what other people are doing. Okay? And so there isn't that personal identification that I know what I need. I need to be valued. I need to be appreciated. I need to be seen. Of course, this relates to other people, but these are sort of these are the sorts of things that I think that when a person isn't validated in their own family, that they don't believe that they're lovable. They don't, and if you don't believe you're lovable, how in the world, and you don't love yourself, how in the world are you ever going to believe that anyone could love you? So we have to learn to love ourselves first, but how do we do that? I think we have to look. We have to look outside at the society, at the culture. We have to look at our family and understand that there were things that went on in our family that maybe weren't healthy and created this this kind of pattern that we get into. So parentification, people who have been diagnosed with codependence, one of the characteristics that occurred while they were growing up are two things that I want to talk about, is parentification and triangulation. Now, parentification basically implies that a person who grows up in a family that never had their needs met may, when they have their own children, parentify their own children. And what that means is that the parent now expects to get the kinds of things that they didn't get from their own parents, such as maybe acknowledgement, as love, as validation, that if they did not get it from their parent, they expect to get it from their child. And that's really, because when we look at the difference between what we call a functional family or a dysfunctional family, that in the dysfunctional family, there are not any clear boundaries. The parent and child does not have a parent-child relationship in the sense that the parent is being the parent. A lot of the times the child is assigned the parental role. So a lot of you can think about that, that when you were growing up, did one parent or the other parent or maybe both parents sort of expect from you the kinds of behaviors and nurturing that they themselves never got when they were growing up? The other thing is triangulation, and I think this ties in with parentification too, because triangulation is just exactly what it says. It's a triangle. There's you on one corner, there's your mom on one corner, and your dad on the other corner. Now, when we talk about triangulation, we're talking about the child being on one end, right? One part of the triangle. The parents don't relate to one another, so what do? They go to the child instead, and they mediate through the child in hopes of making their relationship with their spouse or partner better. But instead of going directly to their partner for whatever reason, maybe they have a hard time expressing their feelings. Maybe they are afraid of the kind of chaos that will break out if they mention their needs. So what they do is they use the child, they triangulate the child, and they say things like, you know what, if your dad would only stop doing these things, I'd be a lot happier, and then I wouldn't get so mad at you, and then we'd all be happier. So the child runs to dad and says, Dad, you know what? If you would stop doing that, then Mom would be a lot happier and we would be a lot better family. And so then Dad says, well, yeah, but your mother, blah, 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 blah. And so then the child runs back to the mom and says, well, Mom, you know what Dad said? Really catch yourself in that kind of triangulation, whether you're doing it or whether it was done to you. Don't let it happen anymore. Recognize it. Recognize that that space in your soul was filled up with other people's junk, and that what you need is space for your own needs and desires to emerge, and for you to be able to let other people take care of their own stuff. Okay? The lack of attunement, again, is the lack of attunement. I think I talked about attunement in the last webinar, where we're looking at this concept that people who can pick up on your nonverbal cues, people who pick up on your even internal states, emotions that might be coming up, that when someone attunes to you, you feel seen. And that's one of the things that I would say probably is lacking from the family that exacerbates the development of codependent behaviors, because there is no attunement. Your needs as a child are not important in this kind of a family. What's important is that you behave and that you do what I tell you to do, because that's the way we're going to keep chaos from erupting. So there's that non-validation of emotions. But what this creates is, for the child, is basically learning to do damage control. In other words, I won't do this, and if I don't do that, then you won't get mad. And this translates into our adult relationships, where basically we monitor ourselves, we are vigilant to what is the feeling that I'm having right now. And if I tell my partner this feeling, is this going to create a problem? And if it is, I'm not saying anything, because that's the codependent way, okay? But really, for health to, emerge into our lives, for happiness to come into our lives and stay in our lives, we have to be able to express ourselves. We have to be able to assert what those feelings are and risk that there may be chaos. But we have to realize that it's okay. It's okay to have conflict, because it is through conflict that we begin to delineate. We begin